Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, we've got a lot of ground to cover today, so let's jump right in. We're going to objectively map out a massive, highly sweeping analysis recently laid out by media personality and Blaze Media founder Glenn Beck. In a recent, incredibly extensive interview, Beck unpacked a worldview that is, honestly, quite complex. It's a web that connects American history education, global geopolitics, some pretty controversial historical parallels, and what he ultimately defines as literal spiritual warfare. Now, whether you've been following his work for years, or you're just curious about the ideological frameworks that are currently shaping modern conservative discourse, we are going to untangle these interconnected theories. And we'll be doing that using the exact claims and historical references he presented. To make sense of a blueprint this big, we've broken it down into 5 distinct chapters. First, rewriting American history education. Second, an alliance of extremes. Third, Dugan and the Fourth Theory. Fourth, historical parallels and warnings. And finally, spiritual warfare and localism.
All right, starting with Section 1, Rewriting American History Education, specifically looking at the Torch Initiative.
Before Beck tackles any global threats, he starts right at home. He points to what he sees as a massive crisis in American constitutional literacy, arguing that this fundamental lack of understanding is the root of the country's vulnerabilities. So, to counter this, he's introduced Torch. It's an educational platform he founded designed to teach history and constitutional principles using a ton of different multimedia. His goal is to reach people right before America's 250th birthday, tailoring the content so it works for all kinds of learning styles: visual, auditory, reading-based, the whole shebang. In fact, he considers this to be his final major life project. What's really fascinating here is the methodology he's pushing. He is actively trying to replace progressive educational models. So instead of just memorizing dates, Torch uses catechism-style learning. That basically means asking critical questions, like where exactly is the line for offensive speech, to spark a deeper understanding. They've also got a schoolhouse rock-style song called Five in the First to teach the First Amendment, an incredibly immersive 400-track audio drama called The American Story, and they're even partnering up with PragerU to roll out AP history courses for schools. And that approach totally illustrates his core educational philosophy. As Beck puts it, they're missing how to think, not what to think. He argues that today, in the age of Google and AI, just memorizing facts is completely useless. Instead, he believes the survival of the nation literally depends on citizens developing the critical thinking skills to actually articulate and defend their constitutional rights. Moving right along to Section 2, an alliance of extremes, focusing on the geopolitical threat. Having set that domestic baseline, Beck shifts gears pretty radically to the international scene. To explain his geopolitical worldview, he relies heavily on historical patterns, pointing directly to the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Beck claims that the Ayatollahs successfully partnered with Marxists, using universities and mosques together to overthrow the Shah. But here's the crucial part. By 1980, once they were in power, the Ayatollahs' regime turned around and killed or imprisoned an estimated 50,000 of those very same Marxists. Beck uses this as a really stark warning to modern Western political factions. Extreme movements will happily partner with, quote, useful idiots to gain power, only to completely destroy them the minute they have it. This brings us to a very specific theological claim Beck makes about the current Iranian regime. He asserts that the key players in Iran are driven by a Shiite eschatology known as the Twelvers. Essentially, this group believes in a hidden 12th imam who is going to return and bring global peace under Islamic rule, but, and this is a big but, only after the world is washed in blood. Fascinatingly, Beck notes that in this theology, Jesus is believed to return as well, but his role is to act as an enforcer for that 12th imam. Beck claims it's this extreme end-times theology that's the real driver behind Iran's nuclear ambitions. Which leads to a massive point he makes regarding international relations. He puts it bluntly, if you don't have that framework, no answer works. Beck argues that traditional Western diplomacy completely falls flat because our leaders refuse to take this apocalyptic religious framework seriously. You simply cannot, in his view, use traditional negotiation tactics with leaders who are operating under end-times theology. Okay, on to Section 3, Dugan and the Fourth Theory, infiltrating the West. If Iran is the external threat, Beck also identifies an internal ideological threat that he believes is creeping into conservative circles right here in the West. Enter Alexander Dugin. Beck points to this Russian political philosopher and strategist as a primary architect of America's division. According to Beck, Dugin has been actively plotting the polarization and eventual breakup of the United States since the 1990s.
He claims Dugin is running a highly sophisticated propaganda campaign targeting what Beck calls the woke right. These are prominent Western conservative podcasters and thinkers who Beck says are unwittingly parroting Dugin's talking points. To really get what Dugin is after, you have to look at his fourth political theory. Beck explains it like this. Dugin views the first theory as capitalism, the second as fascism, and the third as communism. So Dugin's proposed fourth theory? It basically merges the strong-arm authoritarian tactics of both fascism and communism, uniting them under the banner of traditional Russian Orthodox and Islamic rule. And the explicit goal of all of this? Destroying Western liberalism. This ideological contrast is exactly why Beck is sounding the alarm. Traditional American conservatism, in Beck's view, is firmly rooted in Enlightenment principles, specifically the absolute freedom and choice of the individual. In stark contrast, he argues Dugin's ideology completely rejects the Enlightenment. It leans heavily into a collectivist approach, pushing an authoritarian traditionalism where the state, or some strongman, dictates morality, totally discarding individual liberty in the process. So why on earth are people falling for this? Well, Beck admits Dugin is effective because his initial diagnosis hits the nail on the head. Beck says he is right in diagnosing the problem, but I'm telling you, his cure is poison. Beck completely agrees with Dugin that the West is suffering from profound moral decay. That's what makes Dugin's promise of a strict traditionalist fix so seductive to some conservatives. But Beck insists that surrendering individual freedom to take that authoritarian cure will be absolutely fatal to the American experiment. That brings us to Section 4, Historical Parallels and Warnings. This idea of a seductive authoritarian cure brings up a highly dramatic historical parallel for Beck. He asks a pretty provocative question. How does the societal landscape of 1930s Germany actually map onto the cultural shifts we're living through today? For Beck, understanding this specific chunk of history is the absolute key to spotting the trap he thinks America is walking straight into right now.
Let's walk through Beck's timeline here. He notes that after World War I, German churches completely lost their cultural credibility. Because of that, the Weimar Republic in the 1920s embraced what he calls profound immorality. Since the discredited churches couldn't fight this cultural decay on their own, Beck argues they made a fatal deal. They partnered with Nazi brown shirts, essentially using street thugs to physically enforce morality. And of course, once the Nazis were empowered, they seized absolute uncontrollable power. Beck's warning is crystal clear. Do not align with corrupt strongmen just because they promise to clean up a broken culture.
To make this historical parallel even sharper, Beck zeroes in on one specific year, 1926. He claims that in 1926, Berlin, the first gender transition surgeries were taking place, and that universities were pushing concepts of fluid gender and sexuality. He uses this specific data point to argue that the fierce cultural debates inflaming America today are eerily identical to the cultural environment that immediately preceded the rise of authoritarianism in Germany. Amidst all of these looming threats, Beck feels America is being dangerously complacent. He says, they are sticking their finger in the dike, waiting for us to bleed out. He argues that everyday Americans are mostly just trying to get by, hoping to make it to the next election or their next paycheck without the whole system falling apart. Meanwhile, our global and ideological adversaries aren't rushing. They are patiently holding their ground, literally just waiting for the United States to internally collapse from its own division and moral exhaustion. And finally, we arrive at Section 5, Spiritual Warfare and Localism. After outlining those massive educational gaps, geopolitical extremist alliances, Russian propaganda, and dire historical warnings, Beck concludes that the ultimate solution isn't political at all. It's deeply personal and spiritual. He frames the current state of the world, especially the sudden, intense spikes in global division and anti-Semitism, as literal spiritual warfare. He asserts that a tangible spiritual awakening actually happened recently, and that all this rising chaos is a direct counterattack by satanic forces targeting spiritually weak individuals to sow division. In his view, you simply cannot solve a spiritual battle with political maneuvering. So what's the actual takeaway here? Well, Beck distills all these grand theories into 4 very concrete local steps for his audience. First, stop agonizing over global machinations and fix yourself locally. Second, learn the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence like your life depends on it. Third, turn to faith, relying on God rather than political schemes. And fourth, and this is crucial, refuse political shortcuts. He strongly urges his audience never to vote for or support a corrupt or immoral leader just because it feels like a quick way to win a culture war.
This quote really sums up his entire urgent plea. The choices are eternal, and we are refusing to make any eternal choices. Beck is arguing that Americans are so distracted by temporary tribal political victories that we're completely missing the bigger picture. The actual battle, in his eyes, requires standing firm on eternal, spiritual, and constitutional principles, regardless of what it costs you politically in the short term. Which leaves us with a massive question to ponder. As geopolitical tensions continue to escalate, and as the old ideological lines blur between traditional political camps, will Glenn Beck's call for a return to strict individual constitutionalism and local faith actually be enough? Will it hold against the highly organized collectivist forces he warns are actively working to dismantle the West? It is a very heavy framework to consider, but understanding these arguments is absolutely crucial to deciphering the current cultural and political landscape. Thank you so much for joining us on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we will see you next time.